Hello class, it's Dr. Bauer's office hours. Let's talk about a funny argument in Book 6 of Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which entails that the world, that is the universe, is a living creature with a soul. Here's some study guide questions to help us get started. 1. What is Hylarchism, and where does the term come from? 2. What is Philo's parody argument for Hylarchism in Part 6 of Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion? 3. What is Cleanthes' vegetative objection to Philo's parody argument? 4. Which cosmological thesis does Hylarchism seem to require? 5. What is Cleanthes' cherry blossom objection to Philo's parody argument, and how does Philo respond? Okay, as always, when I give the answers to these questions, you may want to pause the video in order to write the answers down, type them up, crochet them into a sweater, spray paint them on a wall, or however it is that you best remember the information. So, in Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, three interlocutors, Demea, Cleanthes, and Philo, discussed the viability of an argument which says that God must exist due to the purposive structure of nature. In my last video, I reviewed this argument, along with some objections that Philo presses against it, and it's in Book 6 of Hume's Dialogues that Philo gives a parody of the argument which we have been talking about. Here's the parody argument. 1. The world closely resembles an organism's anatomy. 2. Closely resembling effects have closely resembling causes. 3. So, the world closely resembles an organism's anatomy, and closely resembling effects have closely resembling causes. That's just conjoining 1 and 2. 4. If the world resembles an organism's anatomy, and if closely resembling effects have closely resembling causes, then whatever sustains the world is similar to whatever sustains the life of organisms. 5. So, whatever sustains the world is similar to whatever sustains the life of organisms. That's modus ponens on 3 and 4. 6. If whatever sustains the world is similar to whatever sustains the life of organisms, then the world is a living creature with a soul. 7. So, the world is a living creature with a soul. That's using modus ponens on 5 and 6. 8. If the world is a living creature with a soul, then God is the soul of the world. 9. So, God is the soul of the world. That's 7 and 8. Okay, so what's going on in this argument? Well, it's like this. Earlier in the dialogue, Cleanthes said that the world resembles a machine, and from that observation he concluded that the world must be designed like a machine. There must be a cosmic designer. Philo here offers a parody of that argument. First, he notes that the structure of the world is very much like the anatomy of a living organism. In a living organism, you have a number of different organs and cells which are organized towards a single end, the life of the organism. And in the world, you have many different parts and bits which are intricately organized towards singular ends. So the world resembles the anatomy of an organism. But, following Cleanthes' principle that resembling effects must have resembling causes, it should follow that the structure of the world is caused or sustained in the same way that the anatomy of an organism is caused or sustained. And, according to ancient Greeks, the cause of a living organism's structure and sustenance is its soul, a single organizing principle which is responsible for the organism's growth and life. So, if the world resembles a living thing, and living things are caused and sustained by their souls, and like effects have like causes, it should follow that the world too is alive and has a soul. And in the same way that Cleanthes inferred that the artisan of the world must surely be divine, so does Philo infer that the soul of the world must also be divine. Thus, Philo's argument entails that the world, that is the universe, is a living organism and God is its soul. The three interlocutors in Hume's dialogue rightfully attribute this view to ancient Greeks and Romans. In Plato's Timaeus, for instance, the philosopher explains how the world is a living organism with a soul. And, When Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was discussing this view, he called it Hylarchism, coming from the Greek words hyle for matter and arche for principle. Hylarchism is the view that the world is an organism and it has a divine soul. Philo's parody argument is an argument for Hylarchism, but because he is presenting it as a parody argument, he does not genuinely endorse its conclusion. Instead, Philo is using the argument this way. Philo is claiming that if Cleanthes' argument is viable at all, then so is this argument for Hylarchism. But this argument for Hylarchism, he claims, is not viable. It's absurd. So, he says, we should conclude that Cleanthes' argument is also not viable. The idea is, well, if your teleological argument is good, then so is this one. But we know that this one is not good at all. So much the worse for your teleological argument, Cleanthes. Now, Cleanthes' first objection to Philo's parody argument is this: that if the universe is a living organism, it does not seem to have any perceptual organs, nor does it seem to have any center of cognitive activity. Indeed, the idea that the world could perceive anything is kind of absurd. After all, if there were something for the world to perceive, it would be interior to the world, part of it. Given these observations, says Cleanthes, Philo's argument should entail that the world is not an animal organism, but a vegetable one, like a giant cauliflower. And that's rather absurd. Cleanthes' objection, in other words, is as follows. First, if Philo's parody argument is sound, then the world should be a giant vegetable. 2, but it is absurd that the world should be a giant vegetable. So, 3, so Philo's parody argument is not sound. In addition to the vegetative argument, however, Cleanthes points out that there's another sort of problem with Hylarchism. For according to its ancient adherents, says Cleanthes, a living soul requires a body, and God, furthermore, is an eternal being. So if God is the soul of the world, this would mean that the world, God's body, has always existed. In other words, Hylarchism seems to entail the eternity of the world. And since the three interlocutors in Hume's dialogues are professed Christians, this will not do. To put it another way, the problem is this: God is an eternal being, and a living soul requires a living body. So if God is the living soul of the world, it follows that the living soul of the world is eternal. This would require its living body, the world, to be eternal. Thus, God's being the soul of the world requires the eternity of the world. And, to provide an argument against the eternity of the world, Cleanthes starts talking about cherry blossoms. Cleanthes' objection to the eternity of the world is basically this: if the world is eternal, that is, if it has lasted forever, why is it that cherry blossoms only came to Europe a couple centuries ago? Indeed, if the world is really eternal, cherry blossoms should have arrived in Europe eons ago. Billions upon billions of years ago they should have arrived in what is now Europe. The fact that cherry blossoms only arrived in Europe a couple centuries ago, according to Cleanthes, is proof that the world cannot be eternal. Now, while this is an interesting argument, Philo points out that it's full of assumptions, dubious ones. And the chief of them is this: in pressing his cherry blossom objection, Cleanthes is assuming that the world does not undergo tumultuous geological events that exterminate whole species and change the face of the planet. If we allow for such things, however, it's quite possible that cherry blossoms came to Europe, then there was some kind of geological event wiping out lots of stuff, then cherry blossoms had to come to Europe again, and then there's another geological event. The fact that cherry blossoms recently came to Europe in our history, in other words, does not rule out that the world is eternal. Instead, claims Philo, it only rules out that both the world is eternal and that the world hasn't changed very much. So, concludes Philo, Cleanthes doesn't really have an argument against the eternity of the world. And indeed, at the end of part 6, Philo goes so far as to say that he thinks the world could be eternal, a heretical remark that makes his two interlocutors nervous. But anyway, that's a short video about the argument from Book 6 of Hume's Dialogues. This argument concerns the wacky idea that the world is a living organism and that God is its soul. What do you think of that idea? Have you ever thought of it on your own and thought that it might be plausible? Have you ever read it somewhere else? Or maybe you think it's very implausible? Let me know what you think in the comments. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching, and stay tuned for more philosophy of religion videos.